My name is Frank Whitfield. I'm 61 years old, and for the last 11 years, my son-in-law has believed I was nothing more than a broke old man who used to wear a uniform. Tonight, at my granddaughter's 7th birthday party, he stood at the head of the table, raised his glass, and told 20 of his closest friends and colleagues exactly what he thought of me. My father-in-law, he said, smiling, swirling the wine in his glass, served his country as, "What was it again, Frank? A supply clerk?" He laughed. The table laughed with him. These days, he just sits at home, retired, fixed income. You know how it is. I sat at the far end of the table, in the folding chair someone had added at the last minute because there hadn't been enough seats. I smiled. I picked up my fork. I said nothing. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I have sat through worse than this. I have sat in rooms where men decided who would live and who wouldn't, and I never flinched because flinching wasn't part of the job. A joke at a birthday party was nothing. It shouldn't have been anything at all. And yet it landed somewhere soft in me, the way certain things do, no matter how many years of training you've had, no matter how many rooms you've survived. In my jacket pocket, my phone began to vibrate a call from a number I hadn't seen in almost 4 years. A number that only rings when something has gone very, very wrong somewhere in the world, and someone remembers that I'm still the only person alive who knows how to fix it. By the end of that night, my son-in-law would understand exactly who he had been laughing at. But right now, sitting there with cake frosting on a paper plate in front of me, and my own family's laughter ringing in my ears, he had no idea. And for 11 years, that had been exactly how I liked it. Tonight, that was about to change. Let me tell you how it happened and everything that came before it. The life before. I need to take you back further than tonight because you won't understand what happened at that dinner table unless you understand who I actually am, not the version Marcus decided I was, but the real one. I grew up in a small town in eastern Ohio, the son of a steelworker who lost 2 fingers to a rolling mill and never complained about it once in my presence. My father believed in 3 things: hard work, silence about pain, and showing up. I think, in a lot of ways, I inherited all 3 from him, for better and for worse. I enlisted at 19, the week after my father's funeral, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with the anger I was carrying. 28 years later, I retired a very different man than the one who walked into that recruiting office, quieter, more careful with words, more aware of how much of life happens in rooms nobody else ever sees. The first 16 years of my career were the kind you could explain at a dinner party without anyone's eyes glazing over. Infantry, then logistics, moving equipment, coordinating convoys, the unglamorous machinery that keeps an army fed and armed and functioning. I was good at it. I was promoted steadily. I met my wife Eleanor at a USO event in 1994, and I married her 11 months later in a ceremony so small it fit in her mother's backyard. Eleanor used to say I had a foreman's mind. I saw systems, not chaos, even in the middle of chaos. That instinct is, I think, the reason a colonel named Whitcomb pulled me aside in 2003 and asked if I'd be interested in something different, something that would mean disappearing from my own life for weeks at a time, something I could never fully explain to my wife, my daughter, or anyone else for the rest of my career and likely for the rest of my life. I said yes. Eleanor, God rest her, never once asked me to explain more than I could give her. That's a rare kind of grace, and I didn't understand how rare it was until I met people who didn't have it. The last 12 years of my service were spent in a division most people have never heard of, and for good reason. It wasn't designed to be heard of. Intelligence coordination, strategic assessment, source verification during active operations. The kind of job where you don't get medals pinned on your chest in a ceremony with a marching band. You get a handshake in a windowless room from a man whose name you'll never say out loud, and then you go home and mow your lawn like nothing happened. Because as far as the neighborhood is concerned, nothing did. There were deployments Diane, my daughter, remembers only as the time Dad missed my recital or the summer Dad was gone. She couldn't know that one of those summers, my analysis kept an extraction team from walking into an ambush that would have killed all 14 of them. She doesn't know that another one of those business trips involved 41 sleepless hours verifying a single piece of intelligence that, if wrong, would have ended in a diplomatic disaster the history books would still be arguing about today. She knows her father was in logistics, sort of. That's the sentence I handed her, because it was the only one I was legally and morally permitted to hand her, and because by the time she was old enough to ask harder questions, I had already spent so many years being careful that carefulness had simply become who I was. Eleanor passed 6 years ago, a fast, cruel cancer that took 8 months from diagnosis to the funeral. I retired the following year, at 53, and I did not buy a boat. I did not move to Florida. I bought a small house 2 streets over from Diane, because after 28 years of missing birthdays and school plays and Christmas mornings, all I wanted, in whatever years I had left, was to finally be times present. Not important, not decorated, just present. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup with 210,000 miles on it, because it still runs and because Eleanor used to ride in the passenger seat with her feet up on the dash, and some part of me isn't ready to let that go. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. To my neighbors, I'm just Frank, the quiet guy who waves from his porch, fixes the Henderson's mailbox after every storm, and helps push cars out of the snow every February without being asked. Marcus. Diane married Marcus 5 years ago, 2 years after her mother died, at a time when I think she was looking understandably for a sense of stability and forward motion that our small, grieving household hadn't been able to give her. Marcus is a corporate attorney. Sharp suits, sharper opinions, a corner office with a view he mentions more often than seems necessary. The kind of man who measures other men by their job titles, their zip codes, and the size of their driveways. From the very first dinner we shared at a restaurant, where he spent 10 full minutes deciding which wine properly complemented the appetizer, while the waiter stood there nodding along like this was the most important decision of the evening, I understood exactly what kind of person my daughter had chosen. I didn't say anything. Fathers rarely get a real vote in these things, and I'd learned a long time ago which battles are worth spending yourself on. He was never outright cruel to my face. Not at first. It was smaller than that, quieter. The kind of thing you could almost convince yourself you'd imagined. If you tried hard enough, and for years, I tried. The night I almost told him. There was one night early in his and Diane's relationship when I almost told Marcus the truth, or as much of the truth as I was ever allowed to give anyone outside a secure facility. It was a 4th of July barbecue, the summer before they got engaged. Marcus had a few beers in him, loosened up in the way people do at backyard cookouts, and he asked me, almost sincerely, what the worst day of my career had been. I remember standing there at the grill, tongs in hand, feeling the question land somewhere it hadn't landed in years. I thought about telling him about a January morning in a location I still can't name, when a piece of intelligence I'd staked my entire professional reputation on, turned out to be accurate in every detail except one small, devastating variable that cost a young corporal his life during the operation that followed. I thought about telling Marcus that I still, to this day, wake up some nights running that variable back through my head, wondering if there was a version of that analysis where I caught it in time. I opened my mouth to say something close to the truth, some sanitized, careful version of it anyway. And then Marcus's phone buzzed, and he glanced down at a work email and said, "Sorry, hang on, this is important," and the moment simply evaporated. The way moments do when the person across from you has already decided, on some level, that whatever you're about to say isn't going to be as important as what's on his screen. I finished flipping the burgers. I never brought it up again. I think that night taught me something I already half knew, that there's a specific kind of loneliness in almost being understood, and then watching the opportunity close over like water. After that, I stopped offering the door. I let him keep believing whatever version of me was easiest to hold. Christmas, 3 years ago. The first time it happened in a way I couldn't talk myself out of noticing was Christmas 3 years ago at Marcus's parents' house. His family has money, the kind that shows up quietly in the artwork on the walls, in the housekeeper who refilled our water glasses without being asked, in the way everyone at the table seemed to already know which fork belonged to which course. Marcus's father, a retired judge named Elliot, asked me politely enough what I'd done in the service. It was, I remember thinking, the first genuinely curious question anyone in that family had asked me in the 2 years I'd known them. Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in. Frank was in logistics mostly. Paperwork. Filing. He said it lightly, almost affectionately, like he was doing me a favor by keeping the conversation simple for the table. Not exactly times Call of Duty, right, Frank? He winked at his father, clearly pleased with the joke. I could have corrected him. I could have said that my full service record was classified, that logistics was the version I was legally permitted to say out loud at a dinner table, that there was an entire second career underneath that single word that Marcus would never in his life be cleared to hear about, no matter how many law degrees he collected. Instead, I smiled, said something like that, and passed the potatoes. Diane caught my eye across the table. She knew there was more to it. She'd grown up watching me leave for training exercises that lasted 4 months at a stretch, watching her mother, before she passed, receive phone calls in the middle of the night that she was never allowed to explain, watching me come home some years with a different, quieter kind of exhaustion than the year before. But Diane said nothing that night either. I think she'd already learned by then that correcting Marcus in front of his family cost more than it was worth, and that keeping the peace was its own kind of full-time job. The pattern sets in. That Christmas became the template. A joke here, a small dismissal there. Nothing large enough, on its own, to justify a confrontation, and that, I've come to understand, is exactly how this kind of disrespect survives. It never gives you a single moment large enough to fight. It only gives you 1,000 moments too small to bother with, until one day you look up and realize you've been quietly erased over the course of several years. At his law firm's holiday party the following year, Marcus introduced me to one of his partners as, "My wife's dad retired Army, grows tomatoes now." Not a lie, exactly. I do grow tomatoes. It's one of the few things that's kept my hands busy since Eleanor passed. But it was never the whole truth, and he never once asked for the whole truth. He'd already decided, somewhere early on, who I was. And that decision apparently didn't require any further information from me to remain settled in his mind. I remember standing in the corner of that party, holding a glass of sparkling water because I don't drink much anymore, watching Marcus work the room like a man campaigning for office, and thinking, he has no idea what he doesn't know about me. And I'm not sure he's ever once wondered. That's the part that stayed with me longest. Not the joke itself, but the complete absence of curiosity behind it. The 5th anniversary gala. As the years went on, the comments stopped being occasional and started being close to constant a background hum. I learned to tune out the way you learn to tune out traffic noise outside a bedroom window. 2 years ago, at his law firm's 5th anniversary gala, Marcus stood in front of 40 of his colleagues and, gesturing toward me with his champagne glass, said, "This is my father-in-law, career military, now enjoying his retirement growing vegetables." A few polite chuckles rippled through the crowd. One woman, genuinely curious, asked me what rank I'd held. Marcus answered for me before I could open my mouth. "Something in the middle, I think. Nothing too exciting." I stood there in the navy suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion, the same suit, I'll admit, that I'd later wear to Lily's birthday party, because I don't buy new suits often, and I felt something in my chest that I recognized from decades of training myself not to react to provocation. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something closer to grief. The particular grief of being erased in real time by someone who had never once asked me a genuine question about my own life. It doesn't look right. It got worse, or maybe just more concrete, when my granddaughter, Lily, was born. I offered, gladly and eagerly, to help pick her up from school on the days Diane worked late. It would have meant something to me. It would have meant everything, honestly, in those first lonely years after Eleanor died. Marcus said no. His exact words, relayed to me secondhand through Diane because he apparently couldn't say them to my face, were, "I don't want the neighbors thinking he's like hired security or something. It doesn't look right, an old guy in a beat-up truck idling outside the school." I didn't argue. I never argued. 28 years of service teaches you which battles are worth fighting and which ones you let go of. And I told myself again and again that this was the second kind. Diane apologized on his behalf, more than once, in the particular tired voice of someone who has apologized for the same person too many times already. Diane's quiet retreat. But it wasn't just me being dismissed anymore. That was the part that actually kept me up some nights. Diane was starting to go quiet too, starting to laugh a half-second too late at Marcus's jokes about me, the specific, hollow laugh of someone trying to convince herself that something isn't as unkind as it sounds, because believing otherwise would mean admitting something uncomfortable about the man she'd married. There was a Sunday, about a year ago, when Diane brought Lily over for a visit while Marcus was at a work event. We sat on my porch drinking lemonade, and out of nowhere she said, "Dad, do you ever wish you'd talked about the Army stuff more? Like, with Marcus's family?" I asked her what she meant. She looked down at her glass for a long moment before answering. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like they think you were just, I don't know, background. And I never correct them, and I don't know why I don't. I told her it was all right. I told her some things weren't hers to correct because she genuinely didn't have the information to correct them with, and that much at least was true. But watching my daughter slowly become a little embarrassed by her own father, even while some part of her clearly sensed there was more beneath the surface, was harder to carry than anything Marcus himself ever said directly to me. Career day. Then there was career day, back in the spring, at Lily's elementary school. It's a small tradition the school runs every year. Parents and grandparents come in and spend 15 minutes telling a classroom of 6- and 7-year-olds what they do for a living. Firefighters bring their helmets. Nurses bring stethoscopes for the kids to try on. It's the kind of low-stakes, sweet event that means very little to the adults involved and everything to the children. Diane had asked me, weeks in advance, if I'd want to come and talk about my time in the Army. I said yes immediately. I pictured myself bringing in an old, unclassified field manual, maybe a canteen, telling the kids some harmless story about basic training that would make them laugh. It was, I'll admit, something I'd quietly been looking forward to for weeks. 2 days before the event, Diane called, apologetic, explaining that Marcus had already signed up to speak that day. Instead, something about wanting to talk to Lily's class about what lawyers actually do, a topic he'd apparently been eager to present for a while. There wasn't room on the schedule for both of us, the teacher had explained, not without bumping another parent. I told Diane it was fine. I meant it, mostly. But I sat in my truck outside the elementary school that Tuesday morning anyway, unable to quite make myself drive away, and I watched through the front window as Marcus walked in carrying a briefcase and a poster board, greeted warmly by the teacher, while I sat outside in a parking spot that technically wasn't even mine to occupy, holding an old canteen in the passenger seat that nobody in that building would ever ask to see. Lily waved at me through the classroom window on her way to recess later that afternoon, not realizing I'd been outside the whole time. I waved back and drove home. I never mentioned it to Diane. Some disappointments I've found aren't worth the weight of saying out loud. They just settle quietly into the same place all the others go. The morning of. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Lily's 7th birthday. A backyard party, 20-some guests, a bounce house Marcus had rented that cost more than my entire monthly pension check, delivered by a company van with a cartoon castle painted on the side. I arrived early, like I always do, because showing up early and quietly making myself useful is one of the few love languages I've ever been fluent in. I strung the string lights across the porch railing. I found the wobbly leg on the folding dessert table that nobody else had noticed and fixed it with a shim of folded cardboard before anyone even knew it had been a problem. I helped the caterer's van back into the driveway without hitting the mailbox. Marcus thanked me for the table the way you'd thank a contractor you were paying by the hour, polite, brief, already looking past my shoulder to greet the real guests arriving up the driveway in their nice cars. 20 strangers at my granddaughter's party. By 6 o'clock, the backyard was full. I recognized almost no one colleagues from Marcus's firm, a few couples from the country club he'd recently joined, Marcus's cousin visiting from Chicago. Diane moved between groups with a practiced hostess smile, and I watched her work the crowd the way I imagined she'd learned to. Over 5 years of these kinds of gatherings, learning which version of her family history played well in which rooms. I sat mostly by myself near the edge of the patio, the way I usually do at these things, content to watch Lily chase bubbles across the lawn in her birthday dress. A few guests made brief small talk with me. "And how do you know the family?" one woman asked. "I'm Diane's father," I said. "Oh, how nice," she replied, and moved on to someone more interesting within about 4 seconds. I want to be honest with you, none of this was new. I had made a kind of peace with being the least interesting person at my own daughter's parties. What I hadn't made peace with, what I don't think I ever really could, was watching it happen in front of my granddaughter, who is old enough now to notice things, even if she doesn't yet have words for what she's noticing. The toast. Dinner came at 7. Long tables set up under string lights, caterers moving quietly between them. Marcus stood at the head of the table with a glass of wine to give a toast to his daughter, a genuinely sweet one. At first, about how fast she was growing, about the first time he held her in the hospital. I'll give him that much. Whatever else is true about Marcus, he loves Lily fiercely, and that toast started out from a real place. But somewhere in the middle of it, riding a wave of laughter from an earlier joke, he pivoted the way people do when a room is responding well, and they want to keep the momentum going, and turned the toast into a joke about me. My father-in-law, he said, gesturing my direction with his glass, a grin spreading across his face, served his country as, what was it again, Frank? A supply clerk? Laughter. These days he just sits at home, retired, fixed income, broke old soldier, growing tomatoes. More laughter, warmer now, the kind that feeds on itself. 20 strangers laughed at me that night. I sat in the folding chair someone had added at the last minute because there hadn't been enough seats at the real table, and I smiled, and I picked up my fork, and I said absolutely nothing. But Diane didn't laugh this time. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She stared down at her plate, her hand tightening slowly around the napkin in her lap until her knuckles went pale. Something in her face had finally, quietly, cracked open. And that was the exact moment my phone began to buzz in my jacket pocket. The call. I almost let it go to voicemail. In 8 years of retirement, I had received exactly 3 calls from that particular line, and none of them had ever been good news. They'd been requests for me to remember things I'd spent years trying to set down. I excused myself quietly, the way I'd learned to disappear from a room without anyone particularly noticing, and stepped out through the sliding glass door onto the back porch to answer. Frank, it's Reyes. Colonel Elena Reyes. I trained her when she was a 26-year-old captain who asked too many questions and slept too little, back in a facility whose name I still can't say out loud. She's a senior advisor now, the kind of officer whose calls get returned within the hour by people 3 ranks above her, and I felt the particular, familiar tightening in my chest. That meant the quiet life I'd built for myself was about to be interrupted again. We have a situation, she said, her voice clipped in the way it always got when she was choosing words carefully. The 2003 Kandahar assessment, someone's trying to reopen the file for the congressional review next month, and half the analysts who worked it are dead or unreachable. You're the only one left who actually understands the source chain end to end. The secretary specifically asked for you by name, Frank. We need you back in an advisory capacity, just for the review. I stood there on that porch, phone pressed to my ear, and for a moment my mind went somewhere else, entirely back to a tent in 2003, back to 41 sleepless hours, cross-referencing a single human source against satellite data, back to the particular silence of a briefing room when I finally said, I'm certain, and watched 14 careers and 14 lives pivot on those 2 words. When do you need me? I asked, my voice steady, the old training still there under the flannel and the tomatoes and the 8 years of quiet. For just a moment, standing on that porch with the party noise muffled behind glass, I was back there, not Kandahar itself, but the room in Bagram where we'd built the assessment, 3 of us, and a wall covered in string and photographs and satellite timestamps, running on coffee and adrenaline for 2 straight days. I remembered the exact weight of the silence before I said the words that mattered. I'm certain. I remembered Reyes, 26 years old then, standing in the corner watching me the way a junior officer watches someone she's deciding whether to trust with her own career someday. I remembered how none of it had felt heroic in the moment. It had felt like arithmetic, like holding your breath through a very long, very quiet equation, and only understanding afterward, much later, what the equation had actually been worth in human lives. Nobody at that dinner table 40 feet behind me had the faintest idea any of that had ever happened. Nobody ever would, not in full. That was the deal I'd made a long time ago, and I'd never once regretted it until nights like tonight, when the gap between what people assumed about me and what was actually true felt less like discretion and more like a small, private wound I kept forgetting to let heal. Monday, Washington. We'll send a car. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Some part of you never fully retires, no matter how many folding chairs you sit in at other people's parties. Standing on the porch, I hung up and stood there a moment longer, looking back through the sliding glass door at the party, still going inside at Marcus, mid-laugh, telling another story, gesturing broadly with his wine glass, probably still riding the high of his toast, probably starting in on another line about my thrilling career in tomato agriculture. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the fact that she'd have marched back into that party and set the whole table straight in about 4 sentences flat, and how I'd never once, in 28 years of marriage, managed to be quite that direct. I thought about Diane's hand tightening around that napkin. And then I did something I don't usually do. I walked back inside, and I didn't put the phone back in my pocket right away. I set it down on the corner of the table, screen still lit, Right as Marcus was refilling his glass and starting in on another line, something about Frank's exciting career in tomato agriculture, and I simply let it sit there a beat too long before reaching for it. Again, I didn't plan what happened next. I want to be clear about that. I never plan these things. That's not how any of this has ever actually worked for me. In 28 years of a career built almost entirely around not being noticed. But I've also learned over a very long life that sometimes the truth doesn't wait to be introduced properly. Sometimes it just leans over the table on its own, uninvited, the way it did that night. General Alcott. The man who leaned over was retired Brigadier General Thomas Alcott, Marcus's law partner's father-in-law, as it turned out, invited to the party for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with me. He was 74, silver-haired, the kind of man who still sat with his back perfectly straight out of decades of habit. He picked up my phone without really thinking about it, the way people idly do at a crowded table when something buzzes nearby, just glancing at the screen to see whose ringtone was going off. And he went very, very still. "Whitfield," he said slowly, looking up at me across the table, his fork frozen halfway to his plate. Not a question, a recognition. "Frank Whitfield, you ran the Kandahar assessment team in '03. The table went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone senses something has shifted, even before they understand what. I read your after-action report in a classified briefing 11 years ago," Alcott continued, slowly rising from his chair now, extending his hand toward me across the table like I was someone he'd been hoping his whole career to one day meet. "That analysis probably saved 40 lives in the extraction that followed. Whole division still talks about it in training. I didn't know you were," he glanced at Marcus, then back at me, something shifting and recalculating behind his eyes. "I didn't know you were times Whitfield. My God." "It's an honor, sir." Marcus's face had gone the exact color of the white tablecloth in front of him. The silence. I didn't raise my voice. I've never needed to. That was one of the first things they trained out of me, or maybe trained into me, the understanding that volume and authority are almost never the same thing. "It's all right, General," I said, shaking his offered hand. "Most people don't." The silence that followed was, without exaggeration, the loudest thing I've sat through in years. Louder in its own way than some rooms I've sat in that involved actual gunfire. Marcus opened his mouth twice and closed it again, visibly recalculating 11 years of jokes in real time, watching them collapse under the weight of a truth he had never once bothered to ask me about. Not in 5 years of marriage to my daughter. Diane was staring at me now too. But differently than Marcus was, there were tears standing in her eyes. And I understood, watching her face, that she hadn't fully known either. Not the specifics, not the Kandahar assessment or the 40 lives or any of it. I'd protected her from most of it the same instinctive way. I'd protected everyone, including myself, from a version of my life that was easier to leave sealed shut. What I said, I didn't gloat. I want that clearly understood, because I know how this kind of story can sound when it's told wrong, like a triumphant unveiling, a mic drop, a man finally getting the last word he'd been saving up for years. That's not what this was. I didn't explain the classified parts I still legally couldn't explain. Not even now, not even to my own family at a birthday party. I simply looked at Marcus, across a table that had gone completely silent except for the distant sound of children still playing by the bounce house, unaware that anything had shifted at all. And I said only this: "You don't need to know what I did over there, Marcus. You never did. All you ever needed to know was how to treat the people sitting at your own table." I paused, then added, more quietly, mostly for Diane's benefit, "That's all any of it was ever really about." Then I sat back down in my folding chair, picked my fork back up, and finished my dinner, while 20 strangers who'd laughed at me 40 minutes earlier now sat in a silence so complete I could hear the ice settling in the water glasses. Diane, in the kitchen. A few minutes after I sat back down, Diane found an excuse to slip into the kitchen clearing plates that didn't really need clearing yet, and I followed her in, mostly because I could see her hands were shaking. She set the stack of plates down on the counter a little too hard and turned to face me. Eyes bright with tears, she was clearly fighting to hold back in front of her own guests. "Dad, Kandahar, 40 lives. Dad, why didn't you ever—" She stopped, pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a second, started again. "I've spent 5 years apologizing for you in my head. Do you understand that? Making excuses for you to myself, so I wouldn't have to feel bad about not defending you out loud. And this whole time I let you, I said gently. That part's on me too, Diane. Not just Marcus. Why? Her voice cracked on the single word. I chose my next words carefully, the way I choose most words. Because the day I told your mother what I really did, back before you were born, I watched something change in her eyes. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of weight she never fully put down again. Not for the rest of her life. I didn't want that weight sitting on you too, baby girl. I thought silence was a gift I was giving you. I didn't realize it was also costing you something else entirely. Your own footing, in your own marriage, in your own home. Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, laughed once, wetly. You've been protecting me for 31 years, and somehow I only just now noticed. That was rather the point, I said, and for the first time all evening, I let myself smile all the way. She hugged me then, right there in the kitchen, tighter than she had in years, and I held on to my daughter for a long moment while, through the doorway, I could still hear the low murmur of stunned guests slowly returning to their conversations, the clink of forks against plates resuming, the ordinary sounds of a party trying to remember how to be a party again. Later that night, Marcus didn't say another word for the rest of the party. He drifted quietly through the remaining hour, subdued, uncharacteristically attentive to guests he barely looked at before, occasionally glancing my way like he was trying to reconcile two completely different men occupying the same folding chair. Later, as guests were leaving and I was loading leftover folding chairs into the back of my truck, Marcus found me in the driveway. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. None of the courtroom polish, none of the practiced confidence. I'm sorry, Frank, he said. I really am. I don't know why I never asked. I think I just decided who you were a long time ago and never bothered to check. That's most of it, right there, I told him. Most people don't mean any real harm. They just stop being curious. He nodded slowly, looking down at the driveway. Can I ask what actually happened over there? In Kandahar? No, I said, and I almost smiled. But you can ask me what I actually think of you now, if you want to know that instead. He looked up, uncertain. I think you love my daughter and my granddaughter, genuinely, I said. And I think you've got some growing up left to do about what actually makes a man worth respecting. Those two things can both be true at the same time. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and shook my hand, a real handshake, not the transactional kind he usually offered, and I got in my truck and drove the 2 streets home. Washington. I flew to Washington that Monday, exactly like I told Colonel Reyes I would. I sat in a windowless room for 6 hours, going over a 20-year-old file with analysts half my age, none of whom knew or particularly cared that I'd spent Saturday night being toasted as a broke old soldier at a 7-year-old's birthday party. In that room, none of that mattered. In that room, I was simply Whitfield, the man with the source chain memorized. And that was enough. By Tuesday afternoon, I was back on my porch, fixing the gutter that had been sagging since spring, the same as always. Nobody applauded when I got home. Nobody needed to. That's not really what any of this was ever about. And if you've made it this far in my story expecting a Hollywood ending with medals and applause, I'm sorry to disappoint you. The real ending was much quieter than that. And I think, in the end, much better. Diane. Diane called me the next morning, Wednesday, crying before I even finished saying hello. Dad, I'm so sorry, she said. For years. I let it happen for years. And I told myself it was easier than fighting about it. And I don't even know all of what you actually did, do I? I don't think I've ever really known. No, I told her gently. You don't, and you probably never will, not all of it. That's not because I don't trust you. It's because some of it isn't mine to give away, even to the people I love most. Then how do I make it right? She asked. How do I make up for 5 years of letting him talk about you like that? I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, because I wanted to give her something true, not something comforting. You don't need to make up for it, I said. You just need to remember, going forward, that whoever I was underneath the flannel shirts in the old truck, I was always still your father. That should have been enough on its own, every single time, regardless of what else was true underneath it. Make sure it's enough for Lily, too. One day, no matter what she ever finds out or doesn't find out about anyone she loves. She was quiet for a moment. I will, she finally said. I promise, Dad. What I've learned. I'm not telling you this story because I want credit or sympathy or some kind of vindication tour through the comments section. I spent almost 3 decades learning how to do important, difficult things quietly, without recognition. And that habit doesn't simply switch off because one dinner party finally uncovered part of it. I'm telling you this because I know, with complete certainty, that I am not the only one. There are more of us than you'd think, men and women who came home, folded the uniform into the back of a closet, and let the world assume the smallest, simplest, most convenient version of who we are, either because it was easier than explaining, or because we genuinely weren't allowed to explain, not even to the people who share our last name. We become the quiet one, the retired guy, the broke old soldier. If we happen to be unlucky enough to marry into the wrong kind of family, or unlucky enough to raise a daughter who marries into one. But here is what 28 years in uniform and 61 years on this earth has actually taught me. The people who talk the loudest about what they believe they're worth are almost never the ones quietly carrying the heaviest things. And the people who stay silent at the end of the table, letting the jokes roll past them without comment, sometimes they're not weak and they're not defeated. Sometimes they're simply waiting, not for revenge and not for applause, just waiting for the one moment the truth decides, entirely on its own schedule, to finally stand up and speak for itself. It always should be enough. Being someone's father or mother or grandfather, regardless of rank or clearance level, or what anyone at the table has decided about you without ever bothering to ask. For any of us. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks after the party, Marcus called and asked if I wanted to go fishing with him that Saturday, just the two of us. No wives, no kids, nothing to prove. I almost said no out of pure habit. 28 years of quiet self-sufficiency doesn't unlearn itself in 3 weeks. But something in his voice sounded like he actually meant it, so I said yes. We sat in my old aluminum boat on Miller's Lake for 4 hours and caught exactly one fish between us, a small bluegill that Marcus insisted on throwing back on principle, though I never did figure out what principle he meant. We didn't talk about Kandahar. We didn't talk about the party, or the toast, or General Alcott, or any of it. We talked about Lily's obsession with dinosaurs, and about a case Marcus was working that was clearly wearing on him more than he wanted to admit, and about Eleanor, a little, when he asked carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to what she'd been like. She'd have liked you eventually, I told him. She had a soft spot for people who were still figuring themselves out. Took her about 4 years to fully trust me, if it's any comfort. He laughed, actually laughed. Not the performance version I'd heard at 100 parties, but something quieter and more real. 4 years, huh? I've got a head start then. Only been married 5. We didn't fix everything on that boat. I don't think 4 hours and one bluegill fixes 11 years of small dismissals, and I wasn't looking for it to. But it was a start, and starts matter more than people give them credit for. What Lily asked me. A few weeks after that, Lily climbed up onto my porch step beside me while Diane was inside talking to Marcus, and she asked, with the particular directness only a 7-year-old can manage, "Grandpa, were you a spy?" I laughed, surprised. "Who told you that?" "Daddy said the general man called you a secret hero at my party." "Is that true?" I thought about how to answer her how much a 7-year-old could hold, how much she'd repeat at her own kindergarten career day one day, how much of this was even mine to give away. In the end, I told her something true, even if it wasn't the whole truth, the same way I'd told her mother the same careful sentence for 30 years. "I did some important, quiet work for a long time," I said. "The kind where you don't get to tell people about it even when you want to. But you can always know this. Whatever I did, all of it, every single bit I did it so that families like ours could sit safely on porches just like this one, on ordinary Saturdays, without anything bad happening to them. That's really all any of it was ever for." She thought about that for a moment, swinging her legs off the edge of the step. "That's a good job, Grandpa," she finally said, with the simple, unimpeachable authority of a 7-year-old delivering a verdict. Then she asked if we could go get ice cream. And just like that, the conversation was over, the way the important ones with children so often are. I took her for ice cream. I didn't need any more validation than that. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the quiet one at the table, underestimated by people who never once bothered to ask what you actually carried, tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you know a veteran in your own family who never talks about what they did, who's become the quiet one at your own dinner table, maybe tonight is the night you finally sit down and ask them a real question and actually wait for the real answer. Subscribe for more stories like Frank's every week, right here on the Veteran's Confession. There's always more beneath the surface than the world ever bothers to notice.